The country you live in is younger than the dog asleep on your floor. It is younger than pottery, younger than beer, younger than the oldest tree still standing in the forest near your town. For roughly 97% of the time human beings have existed on this planet, there were no countries at all. No borders, no passports, no flags, no line drawn across any map anywhere on Earth, because there were no maps, and there was nothing to draw a line around. And then, in what amounts to a single blink of evolutionary time, 8 billion people quietly reorganized their entire lives around an idea that somebody, somewhere, simply made up. Nobody voted on it. Nobody signed a founding document for the whole species. Most people alive today have never once stopped to ask where the idea came from, or why they feel it so deeply that they would fight, pay taxes, and in some cases die for a shape on a map that did not exist when their great-great-grandparents' ancestors were born. So, how did we get from a species with no borders to a planet sliced into 193 pieces? The answer stretches across 3 continents, 12,000 years, and at least 4 separate inventions that had nothing to do with each other until humans fused them together into the strangest and most powerful fiction our species has ever agreed to believe. Let's start with the problem. Because before there were countries, there was a very specific limit built into the human skull. And everything that follows is a workaround for it. Here is something most people never think about. Your brain has a ceiling on the number of people it can actually know. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Oxford, spent years studying the relationship between brain size and social group size across primates. In the early 1990s, he proposed that the human brain, based on the size of our neocortex, can maintain somewhere around 150 stable relationships. Not acquaintances, not faces, actual relationships, where you know who a person is, who they are related to, who they owe, who they betrayed, and whether you can trust them. That figure became known as Dunbar's number. Below that ceiling, a group of humans can govern itself with nothing but memory and reputation. You do not need police when everyone knows everyone. You do not need courts when a lie will follow you for the rest of your life, because there is nowhere to hide and no one new to lie to. You do not need a government. You need gossip. For most of human history, gossip was the government. The quiet, constant, relentless pressure of people who know your name was enough to keep a band of 50 people cooperating. But push past that ceiling and the whole system collapses. You cannot personally track 300 relationships. You cannot remember every debt and every grudge across 1,000 people. And the moment you are surrounded by strangers, the moment you are living next to people whose reputations you cannot see, cooperation stops being automatic. Why would you trust someone you will never meet again? Why would you share food, keep a promise, or follow a rule when the person enforcing it has no idea who you are? Think about that. Every single country on Earth today is a machine for solving that exact problem. India has more than 1 billion people. Even one of the smallest recognized states on Earth has more residents than a human brain was ever designed to know. Not one of them runs on personal relationships. Every one of them runs on something artificial, something invented, something bolted on top of a brain that maxes out at a village. The country is that bolt-on. And it took thousands of years to build, one impossible piece at a time. Here is the first piece. For the vast majority of human existence, land was not something you owned. It was something you moved through. When you are a hunter-gatherer following herds and seasons, the ground beneath your feet is a resource you pass over, like the air you breathe. You do not build a fence around the sky. You do not draw a border around a river you will have left behind by next month. Everything changes the moment humans stop moving. Around 12,500 years ago, in the region archaeologists call the Levant, a culture we now name the Natufians, did something that, at the time, was genuinely radical. They stayed. They built round stone houses. They dug storage pits. They ground wild grain on stone. And crucially, they did all of this before they invented farming. They were still hunting and gathering. They simply decided that this particular patch of ground was worth staying on, and they stopped walking away from it. And here is the psychological shift that mattered more than the houses. When you settle, you start burying your dead in one place, and once your grandparents are in the ground beneath your feet, that ground is no longer just dirt. It is your grandparents. It is inheritance. It is identity. It becomes a place you belong to, and a place that belongs to you. And those two feelings are the seed of every territorial claim ever made. The first deed of ownership humans ever filed was not written on paper. It was a grave. You put your ancestors in the earth to say, without a single word, this land belongs to the people who came from these bones. But belonging is a feeling. A border is a fact. And the oldest recorded border on Earth is a genuinely astonishing object. In 1881, a French archaeologist named Ernest de Sarcek was digging in the south of what is now Iraq when he pulled a broken slab of carved limestone out of the ground. It is roughly 4,500 years old, carved only about a century after the Great Pyramid of Giza was raised. And on that slab, in one of the oldest political documents humanity has ever recovered, is an argument. Two neighboring city-states, Lagash and Umma, had spent generations fighting over a strip of fertile farmland between them. The stone records the moment one king defeated the other and forced through a settled boundary, complete with a carved line of soldiers marching in formation and vultures carrying away the dismembered dead of the losers. It even includes divine curses aimed at anyone who dares cross the line again. That object now sits in the Louvre. And if you strip away the ancient language, it is the same thing you will see on any news broadcast tonight. Two groups of people. One line. And absolute certainty on both sides about exactly where one of them ends and the other begins. We were already fighting over borders 4,500 years ago, which means the line came before the country. The willingness to kill for the ground came first. Everything else was built to justify it. A line in the dirt is not enough to make a country. You can draw a boundary around empty land and it means nothing. What you need inside that line is people. A lot of them. Far more than 150. And to hold that many people in one place, you need something humans did not have for most of their history. You need a food surplus. Around 10,000 years ago, in the arc of the Middle East we call the Fertile Crescent, humans began deliberately planting wheat and barley. And agriculture did something no hunting strategy ever could. It let a small piece of land feed an enormous number of people, and it let them store the difference. For the first time. A community could grow more food than it needed today, and keep the rest for tomorrow. But here is the part that turns grain into government, and almost nobody thinks about it. Grain is countable. A field of wheat ripens all at once, out in the open, standing up where anyone can see it. You can measure it. You can divide it. You can store it in a building and know exactly how much is inside. Compare that to a root crop growing underground, invisible, that a family can dig up quietly whenever they are hungry. You cannot count what you cannot see. But wheat, standing in a field at harvest, can be estimated by anyone walking past. And anything that can be counted can be taken. A share of it can be demanded. In other words, grain can be taxed. The political scientist James C. Scott argued that the earliest states did not form around just any food. They formed specifically around grain, because grain is the one crop that a ruler can see, assess, and confiscate on a schedule. The border, the soldiers, the officials, the whole apparatus of the early state, all of it existed in large part to make sure the harvest could be counted and a portion of it collected. Every anthem you have ever heard traces back, at least partly, to the fact that wheat is easy to tax. But you cannot tax people you cannot find. And so the state invented one of the most quietly powerful technologies in all of human history. It invented the count. To collect from strangers, a ruler first has to know they exist. How many households? How many fields? How many sons of fighting age? The Romans built an entire office around this and gave us the word for it, the census, from a Latin verb meaning to assess. And the ambition of the count only grew. In the year 1086, William the Conqueror ordered a survey of nearly his entire newly conquered kingdom of England, recording who owned what, down to the pigs. His subjects were so unsettled by the totality of it, by the sense that nothing could be hidden from the record, that they nicknamed it the Domesday Book, the Book of Judgment. Because being written into the ledger of the state felt, to an ordinary person in the 11th century, a little like being written into the book that decides your fate at the end of the world. A country, it turns out, is partly just an enormous act of counting, and counting, at scale, requires something else humans had to invent from scratch. It requires writing. And here is the detail that rewrites what most people assume about the written word. Writing was not invented to record poetry, or prayers, or love, or history. It was invented to keep track of stuff. The earliest writing we have, from the Mesopotamian city of Uruk more than 5,000 years ago, is overwhelmingly administrative. Lists of grain, records of rations, inventories of livestock, tallies of who delivered what and who was owed what in return. The first thing a human being ever wrote down was almost certainly not a thought. It was a number, next to a picture of a sack of barley. And this makes sense, because Uruk had a problem no village had ever faced. At its peak, it may have held tens of thousands of people, packed into one place, most of them strangers to one another. You cannot run a city of 40,000 people on gossip. You cannot govern by reputation when you do not know anyone's reputation. So they replaced memory with records. They replaced the village elder who remembered everything with a clay tablet that never forgot. Bureaucracy is not a modern annoyance invented to torture you at the tax office. Bureaucracy is the prosthetic memory that let humans cooperate past the limit of the human brain. It is one of the load-bearing walls of every country that has ever existed. Think about what that means. The country runs on paperwork. It always has. The very first states were, underneath the temples and the armies, gigantic filing systems. Now we come to the strangest ingredient of all, and it is the one that separates a country from a mere administrative zone. Land can be surveyed. People can be counted. But none of that explains why a person is willing to feel loyalty toward a million strangers they will never meet. For that, you do not need a wall or a ledger. You need a shared belief. You need a story so powerful that people who have never shared a meal will still treat each other as members of the same group. And humans figured this out shockingly early. In southeastern Turkey, at a site called Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists uncovered enormous carved stone pillars arranged in circles, some of them weighing many tons, decorated with animals and abstract symbols. They are roughly 11,500 years old. That is thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before Stonehenge. And the people who quarried, carved, and raised those massive stones were not a settled civilization with kings and armies. They were hunter-gatherers. Scattered bands, with no city nearby, who came together at this site and built something monumental for a reason that had nothing to do with survival. They built it, as far as we can tell, to gather, to worship, to participate in something larger than a group of 50 people. And the implication is staggering. The desire to believe in something together may have come before farming, before cities, before the state itself. Shared belief might be the very first technology that lets strangers cooperate, because here is the thing Dunbar's number cannot stop. You cannot personally know more than 150 people, but you can believe in the same God as 100,000 people you will never meet. You can follow the same law as 1,000,000. Shared belief is the workaround for the ceiling in your skull. And every country that has ever existed is, at its core, a shared belief, a story that enough people agreed to treat as real. For a long time, that shared story was religion. But eventually, humans invented a second kind of story that could bind strangers together even more precisely. They invented law. Not private revenge, not a family feud settled by a family, but written rules that applied to everyone inside a territory, whether they had ever met the ruler or not. Around 3,750 years ago, the Babylonian king Hammurabi had a code of laws carved into a tall black stone pillar and set up in public. Hundreds of rulings covering property, debt, marriage, injury, and trade. The specific punishments are often brutal by modern standards, but the underlying idea is one of the most important a human ever had, that the same rule applies to a stranger on the far side of the kingdom as to your own neighbor. That you are bound not by who you know, but by where you are. That is the moment personal relationships stop being the glue and law takes over the job. That is a country learning to hold itself together. And the language we still use remembers all of this, if you listen closely. Take the word nation. It comes from the Latin natio, from a root meaning to be born. Originally, it referred to a group of people born in the same place. A birth group. In the great medieval universities, students who had traveled from far away were sorted into nations based on where they came from, long before those places were countries in any modern sense. Or take the word country itself. It comes, through Old French, from a Latin phrase meaning the land lying opposite, the land spread out in front of you. Contra, against, opposite, a country, buried in the very word, is the land facing you. The ground you look out across and claim as the place you are from. The words were carrying the idea of belonging inside themselves for 1,000 years, and most of us use them every day without ever hearing it. So now you have land, marked by graves and defended by force. You have people, fed by grain, counted in a ledger, recorded in writing. You have a shared story, held together by belief and law. Surely now you have a country. Not quite, because there is one more ingredient, and it is the one people forget. A country is not something you can declare into existence on your own. A country only becomes real when other countries agree to treat it as one. Think about it. You could stand in your backyard tomorrow, plant a flag, and declare your garden a sovereign nation. You could write a constitution. You could design a currency. And it would mean absolutely nothing, because no other state on earth would recognize it. Sovereignty is not a thing you possess. It is a thing other people grant you. A country is a fact only because the neighbors agree it is a fact. The moment that idea became the operating system of the entire planet has a date. In 1648. A set of treaties known collectively as the Peace of Westphalia brought an end to a catastrophic stretch of European war. And in doing so, they set down a principle that still governs almost every border negotiation on Earth, that each state has authority over its own territory, and that states recognize one another's right to exist and to run their own internal affairs. The modern world of independent, mutually recognized countries runs, in its basic architecture, on rules that were written down less than 4 centuries ago. For a species that has existed for 300,000 years, 4 centuries is not ancient history. It is the day before yesterday. But sometimes the recognition came first, and the reality was invented to match it. And there is no stranger example of this than what 2 European kingdoms did in 1494. Spain and Portugal, newly obsessed with claiming lands across the ocean, sat down and signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. With the blessing of the Pope, they drew a single line down a map of the entire globe and divided the unexplored world between the two of them. Everything on one side would belong to Portugal. Everything on the other to Spain. They were carving up continents they had never seen, oceans they had never crossed, and the homes of millions of people who had no idea a line had just been drawn straight through their lives by men on the far side of the planet. Sit with that for a second. 2 governments split the world in half with a ruler and a piece of paper. And much of the map that followed was shaped by that single stroke. The borders were not discovered. They were not natural. They were decided by people who would never set foot in the places they were dividing. And that habit, drawing lines through the lives of strangers, would repeat itself again and again for the next 500 years. Here is the part that should be impossible. Even with all 4 ingredients in place, land and people and story and recognition, you still have a fundamental problem. You have millions of individuals who have never met, who disagree about almost everything, who share no personal bond whatsoever. How do you get them to feel, in their chests, that they are the same people, that they are one family? Because without that feeling, a country is just a filing cabinet with a flag on it. The historian Benedict Anderson gave this feeling a name. He called a nation an imagined community. Imagined, because you will never meet more than the tiniest sliver of your fellow citizens, and yet you carry an image in your head of belonging to them anyway. Community. Because despite all your differences, you feel a genuine bond, a shared story, a sense that you and these strangers are somehow in this together. And Anderson argued that this feeling did not appear naturally. It was manufactured, and one of the machines that manufactured it was the printing press. When books and newspapers began pouring out in everyday languages that ordinary people could read, something new happened. Thousands of strangers, scattered across a territory, could open the same newspaper on the same morning and read the same words about the same events. None of them would ever meet. But each one knew that countless others were reading exactly what they were reading. At exactly that moment, in exactly their language. That shared, invisible, simultaneous experience created the feeling of a single community out of a mass of strangers. Print did not just spread information, it manufactured belonging. Other thinkers pushed the point even harder, arguing that nationalism does not wake up a nation that was already sleeping there. It creates the nation. The shared language, the standardized history taught in every school, the flag, the anthem, the founding myths. These are not the natural expression of a people who already existed. They are the tools that manufacture a people, and then convince that people they were there all along. And if you want proof of how recent and how manufactured this feeling really is, look at the single most ordinary object of international travel, the passport. For most of human history, there was no such thing. You could walk, ride, or sail across most of the world without a document proving who you were or where you belonged. As late as the early 20th century, an ordinary traveler could cross much of the planet without a passport at all. It was the First World War that changed everything. Governments, gripped by fear of spies and desperate to control who moved across their borders, made travel documents mandatory. And then, in 1920, an international conference in Paris standardized the little booklet, the size, the layout, the photograph, the stamped pages, essentially the same object you might have in a drawer right now. Think about that. The document that today feels like the ultimate proof of which country you belong to, the thing that decides which borders will open for you and which will slam shut, is barely a century old. The idea that a human being needs a state's permission, in the form of a stamped book, simply to walk across a line in the ground, is younger than the automobile. How did humans invent countries? They did not do it in one moment, or in one place, or with one idea. They did it in layers, over thousands of years, each layer solving a problem created by the one before. First, they ran into a wall built into their own skulls, a hard ceiling on the number of people any human can truly know. Then they stopped moving, tied their identity to a specific patch of ground, and marked it as theirs with the bones of their ancestors. Then they grew grain, which let a small piece of land feed a crowd, and which could be counted, stored, and taxed. And to make that counting possible, they invented the census, the ledger, and writing itself. Then they discovered that strangers could be bound together by shared belief, first religion, then written law that applied to everyone inside a line whether they had met or not. Then they agreed, collectively, to recognize one another's territories as real, turning sovereignty into a fact by mutual consent. And finally, they built the emotional machine. The printing press, and the school, and the flag, and the anthem that convinced millions of strangers to feel like a single family, and they stamped that belonging into a little booklet you carry in your pocket. Was any of this inevitable? In a sense, almost certainly yes. Once you have agriculture, once you have surplus, once you have populations swelling far past the limit of the human brain, some form of large-scale organizing fiction was always going to emerge. Humans were going to be forced, one way or another, to figure out how to live at a scale their minds were never designed for. The probability that we would invent some version of the country, given those conditions, is extremely high. Call it 90%. But the specific shapes on the map, the particular flags, the exact borders, the names you were taught to feel proud of, those were accidents. Accidents of geography, of war, of which king won which battle, of two men in 1494 drawing a line across a world they had never seen. There was nothing inevitable about your country in particular. Somebody could have drawn the line 100 miles to the left, and you would have grown up singing a different anthem and feeling just as deeply that it was the natural one. Tonight, you are going to go home to a country. You will cross its invisible borders without thinking. You will carry its documents, speak its language, maybe feel a flicker of something when you see its flag. And you will almost certainly not think about the fact that the whole thing is younger than the trees, younger than the pottery in a museum, younger than the dog asleep on your floor. For almost the entire span of human existence, it did not exist. There were no countries. There was only land and people on it, and the small, warm, 150-person world that a human brain was actually built for. Everything else, every border and every anthem and every line worth dying for, was invented. Someone settled on a piece of ground. Someone counted the harvest. Someone wrote it down. And someone, somewhere, convinced a crowd of strangers that they were all the same kind of people. That is what a country is, not a place. A story. A story that enough people believed for long enough that it came true.